Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Will the Trade War Mean for Class Politics? This is the second of two webinars sponsored by the Long U.S.-China Institute at UC Irvine on the topic of the U.S. elections and the future of the U.S.-China trade war. If you missed our first webinar, Integration or Decoupling What Lies Ahead, you can take a look at that on YouTube, and we'll drop the link for that in the chat. Also, if you're interested in signing up for the Long Institute's mailing list, or if you want to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, we'll put the link for those in the chat as well. So if you've been following the news on the US-China trade war, you probably know that much of the focus has been on issues like tariffs, protectionism, and international competition, all topics that tend to take the nation or the national economy as their unit of analysis. Somewhat less attention, however, has been paid to the actual workers, laborers, and farm producers who've been caught at the center of these policies. In the webinar today, our three speakers are going to reframe the debate. Rather than emphasizing the sort of us versus them mentality that tends to be pervasive in media coverage of the trade war, our panelists are going to ask the question, is it possible to imagine a trade policy that puts the welfare of all workers, regardless of nationality, at its center? And how might the trade war look different if we examine it through the lens of class politics? To help pose these difficult questions, I'm lucky to be joined today by my colleague, Gustavo Oliveira, who is going to moderate the event tonight. Professor Oliveira is an assistant professor in the Department of Global and International Studies here at UC Irvine, and he is going to introduce our panelists and handle the Q&A at the end of the session. If you'd like to ask a question at any point during the webinar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll collect the questions and ask them on your behalf. Also, if you're not able to stick around to the end of the webinar, the session will be recorded and we'll send the YouTube link out to all registered participants in the next few days. So with that said, I will turn it over to Gustavo.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you everyone for coming today. It's really exciting to have this panel. I'm going to give a little bit more background on what we covered in our first panel already, and to explain how that kind of sets the backdrop and raises a new set of questions that our panelists today are going to be examining. So in the previous webinar, Dr. Jack Zhang gave an overview of the current state of the trade war and the immediate consequences for the United States, arguing that it was pretty counterproductive as a policy and that a sound strategy for rebuilding the US economic competitiveness really needs a change of gear. And then Dr. Yige pointed out that this whole scenario is about much more than just trade. It has to be understood in the broader context of rallying a populist base for the Trump Republican Party, about dealing with the intensifying contest for technological leadership and a growing sense of strategic competition with a more assertive China. And Dr. Yiling Tang, in turn, went over several possible scenarios, ranging from a revitalized WTO framework with high ease of trade and multilateral cooperation to further restriction of both trade and multilateral cooperation all around, and discussed what might be low-hanging fruit and economically expedient but politically challenging courses of action for the incoming Biden administration. Now, that webinar sets a really wonderful backdrop for our present discussion today. But its focus on the nation state as a key unit of analysis, although it's useful for some types of discussion, it actually obfuscates many complexities within the countries that are very important factors that are shaping foreign policy, shifts in global political economy, and the prospects for social and political change on the ground. So, for example, there's important differences in the trade war's effects across economic sectors, across regions, and above all, across different socioeconomic classes, including oftentimes divergent perceptions about the benefits and harms of so-called free trade or binational ties in manufacturing and technological development, and the risks and opportunities implied by the strategic competition between companies and state actors in both China and the US. Now, in the previous webinar, there was also an overall sense that improved trade is beneficial for the economy. But there wasn't enough attention to the socioeconomic inequalities that have aggravated in the US and surged dramatically in China during this period of relatively free trade leading up to the trade war, which leaves open many questions about whether any of the likely scenarios for the reset of US-China relations with the Biden administration can address these long-standing, structural, and aggravating class conflicts within both China and the US. Moreover, the conversation remained largely focused on US policy and the prospects for the US economy in its relation with China, leaving out much to be examined about the socioeconomic changes that are underway in China itself and the prospects for various different groups within China as well. These are the themes we're going to explore now. What lies ahead for class relations within both the US and China, given the prospects of a shift in diplomatic relations ahead. We're very fortunate to have with us for this interdisciplinary panel a group of rising stars among the network of critical China scholars, such as Dr. Igor Dong, Dr. Isabella Weber, and Dr. Jake Werner. Dr. Yige Dong is going to be the first panelist. She's assistant professor of sociology and global and gender and sexuality studies at the SUNY University of Buffalo. She holds a PhD in sociology from the Johns Hopkins University and works at the intersection of political economy, social inequality, and social change. Her book project, From Milltown to iPhone City, Gender, Labor, and the Politics of Care in China, examines the 7-decade transformation of care work among industrial workers as China has transitioned from a socialist state to a capitalist economy. Dr. Dong's research has been published in the International Journal of Comparative Sociology, Critical Asian Studies, and the Made in China Journal, among others. Today, she'll discuss the prospects for Chinese industrial and IT workers and Chinese students in US colleges and universities, as well as domestic perspectives on the current situation. Please welcome Dr. Yige Dong.
All right. Thank you so much for your brilliant introduction of the topics today and the generous introduction of me. And I want to thank once again Emily, Gustavo, and Brian and the Long Institute for inviting me to be part of this very exciting conversation. Let me start time myself since I got about 12 minutes. All right. And let me also start sharing my screen. To have a PowerPoint presentation. So as Emily and Gustavo just introduced, I watched the first part of the trade war webinar, and so I'll just start right from the topic of how to think about this from a sociological perspective on the ground, from within the China, from the domestic perspective within China. And I will cover 3 sectors today: migrant workers, IT workers, and Chinese international students in the US. A caveat I have to make here. So I'm a sociologist leaning towards the more qualitative approach. Since the pandemic, I've been not able to travel to China. It's just so unfortunate. So my analysis today is primarily based on my past research and some initial observations while I'm away from China. So first of all, I'd like to comment on the impact of the trade war on the Chinese migrant workers. All of us are very familiar with the story that there are about 200 to 300 million Chinese migrant workers who are working in the urban areas as either seasonal or long-term wage labor. And they've been really the backbone of the labor-intensive, export-oriented manufacturing industry in China. And we also by now are very familiar with the story that since the trade war starting in 2018, the manufacturing industry in China is the one that got hit most and hardest by the trade war. So some familiar story you might have seen is such as this. This is an NPR story showing that in Dongguan, one of the labor hub, manufacturing hub in the Pearl River Delta, has seen this, empty chairs and empty tables since capital fled China, and many workers are just out of employment since the trade war. But today, what I'm trying to argue, the point I want to make here is that this is actually just one of the most recent episodes of a very long existing trend in the past decade. As early as 2008, since the last global financial crisis, capital has been fleeing China to places like Vietnam and other places where labor is way cheaper than China. And the trade war is really just a catalyst to accelerate this trend. There are several reasons driving this spatial fix of capital. First is the rising cost of labor and the relative shortage of cheap labor. So it's a relative shortage in the sense that China is still, the most populous country, but what's being lack of is the cheap labor there. And also China itself is trying to reorient itself towards more value-added sectors. And relate to that factor, actually service has already surpassed manufacturing to be the largest labor market in China. So for instance, regarding the size of labor force in 2017, the service sector as a whole accounted about 45% of China's total employment, while the industrial sector only account about 28%. So even though our stereotype is still China is the world factory, but in fact, service is the driving leading sector in China. And again, since I cannot go back to China for now, I'll rely on my ongoing research on Foxconn to make my point here. This is the change of the size of the labor force in Foxconn, the Taiwanese-owned company, which is also Apple's largest primary contractor in China. And as you can see, actually, in terms of the size of employment, Foxconn peaked at the year 2012 at the number of about 1.2 million workers. And then the number of employees has been decreasing and slightly bumped up in 2017. And again, when the trade war hit, it just got decreasing even faster. And on top of that, if you look at the national data of migrant workers in China, the rate of growth has been slowing down in recent years. But actually, the trade war does not make a big dent on this picture. So this is another way to show you that there's a long-standing trend over there in terms of the growth of migrant workers. And also there are several interesting characteristics within the migrant labor force in general. Number one is, as I said, the growth has been slowing down in recent years. And number two, recent years, what's driving the slowing growth is not workers going to the coastal areas, but actually workers who are in-province migrant. You know, if you come from this particular inland province, such as Sichuan and Henan, you can go to the local Foxconn workshop without having to go to places like Kunshan or Shenzhen anymore. So that's the driving force for the slowing increase in terms of migrant labor nowadays in China. And then another reason for the rising cost of labor is because of aging. And as you can see, Chinese migrant labor is aging really fast. As of 2019, more than half of the entire migrant worker population is older than 40. And the average age of migrant worker is also a little above 40. So the most typical worker who are making our iPhones are not factory boys and factory girls as we might think of, but actually factory uncles and factory aunties in that sense. And on top of that, China is facing a big issue of aging, the fertility rate has been dropped below replacement rate, so it's below 2.0. And all this are contributing to the factor that the Chinese industrial labor force is aging. And also we can put all this into the context of China's fast urbanization. And this data has to be updated. This is a table I made a few years ago up till 2016. But if you look at data today, 60% of the Chinese population are now urban residents. So China is not the most typical agrarian country anymore. However, there are only, among all the migrant workers, there are only 11% of them who have an associate degree or a college degree or higher. So on the one hand, the state is trying to push industrial upgrading and having more value-added sectors, but on the other hand, the majority of the migrant labor is still below their educational attainment is still below college level. And I'll then shift I'll come back to this when I sum up all these different pieces together. But now let me just quickly comment on the IT sector. So, so the trade war, if there's anything the Chinese government learned from the trade war, is that they have to kind of decouple, like separate their, to stop relying on the US to develop their own IT sectors with high-tech, highly skilled labor in that sector. And yes, the Chinese IT workers is among the most vibrant and well-educated and well-informed labor force who have more capacity to organize and against capital exploitations. For instance, they had this 996 ICU campaign last year, and their slogan is "If we work 996," meaning that from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And 6 days a week, then you'll go to the ICU. And this campaign got international support from American IT workers. But there's a problem within that. I'll come back to this. And finally, many of you might be concerned that the trade war and the China-US decoupling has led to the fact that Chinese international students, the number has been decreasing. Yes, if you look at the historical trend, the quickest growth happened in the mid-2000s. And since the academic year 2019, the growth also has been flattened. But actually, altogether, international students altogether may only make up 5% of the entire US student population. So I think there's some exaggeration of this factor, the decline of this factor. And based on my initial research, even the trade war and the COVID pandemic has not stopped overseas education agencies to sell the business to try to make Chinese students come to the US. They're still working on this today. So putting all this piece together, we had the trade war. I would actually prefer call it the long-term decoupling. We'll see the decoupling definitely happening, I think, in the decade to come. And then you have China decide to Xi Jinping announced this new strategy. Many of you must be very familiar with the term 内循环, internal circulation, to boost up domestic cycle of production and consumption to offset the impact of the trade war and decoupling. I'll wrap up. This is my last slide, and then this is my time clock. Okay. In order to do internal circulation, you have to basically achieve two things. One is to boost household income. The other is to boost consumption. And for household income, there are factors that is actually will produce wage stagnation, as many of the Western countries have seen in the past 4 decades, including the fact that China, like their Western counterparts, have a larger service sector, which is contributed to the stagnation of a general wage, and also lacking of associational power because the authoritarian nature of the regime. And but there are also factors that might contribute to potential growth for example, the state has changing its strategy to more value-added sector, and also the structural bargaining power. I'm referring to the relative shortage of cheap labor, and for consumption. The strategy would be try to make a larger middle class consumer. So now the urbanization rate is at 60% and counting. If consumption, increased consumption is one of the goals, then logically speaking, the state should try to boost up the size of the middle class. For the middle class consumption, the social reproduction sector is the realm where consumption grows fastest. But here you see the problem for middle class household. Actually, investing education is one of the biggest interest, but because of the trade war, you see a counter force that might jeopardize this sector. While we still don't know how the future would look like, but this is a very interesting aspect to observe. And sorry, there's a bar that's overshadowing the last arrow here I want to make. Another issue I want to mention, and I think Jake and Isabella will talk about this also, is the trade war is not just a trade war, but the changing of US containment strategy of China. And I think if the Biden administration is kind of going back to its old globalist elite Democrat approach, then there's space for the Chinese labor movement to maneuver, because you might have a very small niche to seek for more regulation and protection and associational power with the coming back of the international human rights rhetoric. That's one place I can see some interesting things to go. Sorry, I have to just rush through, but I'm happy to talk more about this chart that I made in the Q&A. Sorry, I did go over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yige. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And you were just on time, 15 minutes. Hopefully we can keep the presentations to that or less, so we can have time for the Q&A afterwards. Remind the audience, please submit your questions to the Q&A function. We'll collect them, and we'll be asking the questions on your behalf at the end of the 3 panelists for a group discussion. So next up, we have Dr. Isabella Weber. She's an assistant professor of economics and the research leader for China of the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She holds 2 PhD degrees, one in development studies from the University of Cambridge and another in economics from the New School of Social Research. Dr. Weber works on the economics of China's rise and long-term structures of globalization. Her first monograph, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate, is forthcoming with Routledge, and she's also the principal investigator of the Economic and Social Research Council project, What Drives Specialization? A Century of Global Export Patterns. Today, she'll be exploring the historical parallels between our present moment and the global political economy of the 1930s, characterized by the rise of fascism, presenting this as a framework for understanding how current class dynamics shape US-China strategic competition. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gustavo. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
yes,
can.
Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation, Emily, Gustavo, and Brian. And also, of course, thank you to the Long Institute, and hello, everybody. I think that today's topic, the relation between the trade war and class conflict, goes right to the core of the current global crisis. In this short broad brush talk, I'm attempting to take a theoretical and historical perspective on this critical relation. Many prominent explanations of this crisis that has been looming since 2008 start from the idea that in normal times, economies are in equilibrium or in balance. The massive imbalances we observe are therefore attributed to distortionary policies of one type or another. In a recent paper with Anwar Sheikh, we illustrate this for the case of the currency manipulation argument, where the allegation of currency manipulation starts from the premise that free trade is self-balancing and sees China's currency interventions as the root cause for US unemployment and the global imbalances. In a somewhat similar vein, Pettis and Klein in their recent book, Class Wars Are Trade Wars, start from the assumption that under normal circumstances, economies are internally balanced. However, according to Pettis and Klein, China's policies created class conflict, which has unbalanced its economy, and this imbalance has, quote, spilled over into the United States, end of quote. So it is the, quote, systematic transfers of wealth from Chinese workers to Chinese elites that distort the Chinese economy, and this in turn distorts the global economy, end of quote. In sum, they argue, quote, Chinese underconsumption destroys jobs elsewhere, while inflated asset values lead to devastating cycles of booms, busts, and debt crises, end of quote. Klein and Pettis base their analysis on John A. Hobson's Imperialism, a study of 1902. Hobson attributed imperialism to a lack of domestic demand, which can be the result either of overproduction or underconsumption. This lack of demand, in turn, induced an outward drive for foreign markets, which, in Hobson's own words, as cited in Klein and Pettis, quote, the struggle for markets is the crowning proof of a false economy of distribution. Imperialism is the fruit of this false economy, end of quote. In the very short time I have, I would like to sketch an alternative view that doesn't take a false economy as starting point, but that sees both class conflict and global imbalances as result of the normal workings of the logic of capitalist competition. For this, I think Giovanni Arrighi's conception of cycles of hegemony, as well as Maurice Dobbs' work from the 1930s on imperialism and fascism, can help us conceptualize the origins of the current crisis, tracing them to the over-accumulation crisis of the 1970s. At the heart of this alternative perspective is the notion of over-accumulation as derived from Adam Smith's analysis of the tendency of a falling rate of profit. The argument is that at a certain stage of capitalist development, competition between capitals intensifies to the point that opportunities for profitable investment are narrowing. Dobb argues that in such a situation, export of capital is a way to restore profitability. Capital exports reap higher profits thanks to low wages abroad, ease domestic competition, and undermine the bargaining power of workers at home, which in turn helps restore domestic profitability. Capital exports are thereby organized through large monopolistic companies that aim to exploit low labor costs abroad, but work to prevent full-fledged industrialization of the periphery. Yet, this export of capital is only a temporary fix to the overaccumulation crisis. Eventually, the foreign field of investment is narrowing down, wages start to rise, while peripheral nationalism becomes increasingly aggressive in creating local competition. This, according to Dobb, results in a renewed crisis of global capitalism that can give rise to fascist tendencies in the metropolis. Capitalists in the metropolis work with the state to defend their monopolistic positions and create trade restrictions. The shrinkage of super profits from outsourcing that had been taking place for several decades result in an increasingly depressed middle class, which starts to turn nationalist. The deprived working class, in turn, after years of introducing so-called flexibility into the labor market and the slashing of labor organizations, is politically too weak to come up with an alternative political project, and in its disunity becomes increasingly amenable to nationalism. Eventually, rearmament and organization of the economy, Dobb argues, for war purposes can become the state-led attempt to escape the crisis. This is the theoretical argument as presented by Maurice Dobb, the Cambridge economist, in Political Economy and Capitalism of the year 1937. Dobb, like Hobson, develops his analysis on the initial crisis in relation to the 1870s Great Depression, and his analysis of the renewed global crisis that gives way to fascist tendencies in relation to the interwar period. Yet, Dobb's analysis, I think, is strikingly contemporary. Arrighi and others have long argued that the stagflation crisis of the 1970s marked an overaccumulation crisis that signaled the beginning of the decline of US hegemony. This was also the time when China turned away from a revolutionary path to a primacy of economic development as part of the opening up agenda of the 1980s, and more specifically, the coastal development strategy of the late 80s. The Chinese government decided to follow into the footsteps of the Asian tigers, exploit its disciplined, low-cost labor to attract foreign capital in order to reap revenues that would help finance industrialization and technology transfers without, however, becoming dependent on foreign creditors. As I develop in my forthcoming book, this was one element of China's largest strategy for catching up. The other was the reindustrialization of the state-led core of the economy. As is well known, American firms started exporting their capital to China in pursuit of super profits and made concessions to China's industrialization project in order to be part of the extraordinary expansion of capitalism unleashed by China's reform and opening up. China's increasingly superior cost competitiveness eventually resulted in a massive trade surplus. The low labor costs also created a dependence on investment-led growth and underconsumption. The export of American capital in turn gave rise to the internal dynamics within the US that resemble those discussed by Dobb in terms of the deprived middle class and the increasingly depressed working class. But in the case of China, and unlike the late 19th century, native industrialization could not be prevented. At this current moment, European and US firms for the first time face serious Chinese competition in selected sectors at the cutting edge of technology. The result of this process that has unfolded over the last 40 years or so is a crisis of global capitalism of striking similarity to that conceptualized by Maurice Dobb. This involves the trade war, the ban on Huawei's 5G, and the escalating xenophobia in the US, as well as the increased developmental nationalism and the ambition of greater self-reliance on the part of China. My argument is not that we should think the current crisis as a wholesale repeat of the interwar period. Instead, I suggest that the theoretical framework developed by Dobb and others can serve as a conceptual starting point that complements an analysis that sees the roots of the current imbalance in China's policies with one that foregrounds the US internal dynamic and locates the origins of the present crisis in the trajectory since the stagflation of the 1970s. I hope that this can help us make sense of the structural underpinnings of the trade war and class conflict and situate a careful study of the day-to-day politics and economics within the context of long-term trends and structural dynamics. This, I think, is critical, not least for the project of coming up with alternative solutions to the present impasse. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Isabella, for the presentation and for leaving even more time for the Q&A at the end. Once again, for the audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll be addressing them all together with the panelists at the end. So up next, we have Dr. Jake Werner. He's a postdoctoral Global China Research Fellow at Boston University in their Global Development Policy Center. He received his PhD in history from the University of Chicago, where he was also appointed as a Harper Schmidt Fellow in the University of Chicago Society of Fellows. Dr. Werner studies the emergence of great power conflicts between the US and China following the 2008 financial crisis and explores how new strategies for global development could resolve those tensions. His writings have been published in outlets like Foreign Policy and The Nation, and academic journals like Frontiers of History in China and the Made in China Journal. Dr. Werner also co-founded Justice is Global, a special project in the People's Action Organizing Network that works on reshaping the global economy. Today, he'll be giving us his take on what might lie ahead for class relations within both the US and China, given the prospects of a geopolitical shift in the years ahead. Thank you very much, Jake. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you also to Emily and to Brian and to the Long Institute and to my fellow panelists as well. Very glad to be here. I want to talk a little bit about the class dynamics that we're in the middle of right now. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the structural forces driving the US-China conflict. I want to focus on how working class politics are connected to this. But I do want to emphasize that I think the conflict, there are a number of different sort of structural factors going into this. One side of this is sort of elite politics that requires its own analysis that I'm not going to have time to add here, but is an important part in both economic and military realms that needs to be added in. But I want to talk right now about the kind of popular politics behind the tensions and the sort of emerging great power conflict. So let's just kind of start with a basic proposition. We live in capitalism, and the fundamental necessity of capitalism is growth. So capitalism is a particular form of society in which the patterns of social reproduction are based on the endless accumulation of capital. And what that means is that if we want to find a place in this society for ourselves, we need to, the vast majority of us anyway, need to contribute in some way to that growth dynamic. That is, we need to find a job that will produce profit that will be reinvested to sustain further growth. And what another sort of feature of this is that whether we're talking about public or private purposes, again, these are untenable without growth. And in a state of low growth, we see increasingly sharp competition in a kind of zero-sum struggle over who will benefit from growth and who will be excluded from it and left to stagnation or worse. And finally, if growth stops altogether or begins to decline, then that creates a general crisis that completely disorders all of the structures of the society. And so the basic idea I want to start with is that the US-China conflict fundamentally is a struggle over growth in a newly straightened global economy that emerged after 2008. And we need to, rather than looking narrowly at individual sectors in the economy or at the South China Sea or whatever, all these things need to be seen in their larger context. In the global economy and the declining possibilities for growth in which both countries might sustain that imperative to growth. But there's a problem within capitalism around this, which is that those patterns of social reproduction that give people some certainty and some purpose in their life, they themselves tend to be destabilized by the process of growth. So growth itself tends to disrupt these patterns through technological innovation, through new forms of inequality and social conflict. Growth is also, by its nature, an alienated form of interdependence. What that means is that people have to instrumentalize each other in order to achieve growth, whether that's employers instrumentalizing their employees or vice versa. These are not sort of relationships that are developed as an end in themselves, which means they're very fragile and they're prone to generate a lot of resentment, which means that they can be unstable if they aren't sustaining themselves. The ideology underwriting growth tends to erode over time. At the beginning of a new sort of formation of capitalism, there will always be this sort of sense that we've overcome the previous crisis. We're opening up new possibilities by overcoming the limitations of the old system. Over time, that idea is increasingly exposed as a kind of illusion, and fewer people buy into it. There's another similar problem in that growth produces potentials that push beyond the limits of the existing patterns of growth. So the possibilities that growth itself produces can't be realized within the existing structure of growth, and that introduces a new set of tensions and conflicts. And finally, there's a structural tendency within capitalism towards general crisis, and we won't do a 2-minute version of crisis theory here, but I think given the fact that global capitalism seems to fall into general crisis every 40 years or so, this is plausible on the face of it anyway. So what I want to talk about specifically against this backdrop is, given all of that, how is the working class actually integrated into this system? Because that's one of the key problems that has to be solved within a structure of accumulation. If you don't have workers going to work and producing the profit that will be reinvested, that will sustain growth, then the whole thing will fall apart. So there needs to be a set of patterns and ideas and structures of coercion and attraction that induce people to accept the terms that employers are offering so that the growth process can continue. And a few of these I've listed here. The threat of privation. If you don't do your job, then you're going to be thrown into poverty. The threat or use of violence. This can be either public or private. The history of state violence or business violence to force workers to do what they're thought to have to do is all too heavy on the history of capitalism. Divide and rule. What I have in mind here is the sense that different parts of the working class can be pitted against each other. The divisions range widely from different levels of skill, different racial or cultural backgrounds, as well as different countries. And of course, the US and the Chinese working classes have been pitted against each other in this way for many years. Is one of the sort of sources of the politics that we're talking about today. There's another set of possibilities here: material security, collective purpose, worker power. These are the possibility that workers might benefit, might gain insulation from the insecurities of the labor market, that they could join in a purpose that's larger than themselves and feel like they're part of something that is important for moral reasons. And they are also sometimes invited into the process itself so that they feel empowered in the workplace in a way that buys them into the process of doing the work and making the profit, and so that the profit can be reinvested. And finally, there's another group that we can put under the heading of individualism and consumerism. Individualism can be the sense that if you fail, it's not because the system is rigged, but rather because you yourself are inadequate to the task. So there's a sense of self-blame that goes with this. There's also that's a sort of negative version of this, but there's also a positive version in the idea that you have this sort of freedom to pursue your own interests, to sort of engage your entrepreneurial self in the possibilities that are offered in the marketplace. And then linked to this also is consumerism, that you, by doing the work that's asked of you, you can make the money that will allow you to pursue your interests and desires as a consumer. All right, so these are sort of a general list of the ways that the working class can be integrated into a particular structure of growth. I want to just note here that all of these, under the right conditions, can become dysfunctional to growth, that they can both work effectively as integrating mechanisms, but and this always is involved in the crises that beset capitalism. They also end up serving as problems to growth under the right circumstances. All right, so we'll set that aside and we can talk about it more in the questions if there's desire. So one of the, speaking about the most recent structure of growth, the free market globalization period that began in the 80s and was really consolidated in the 90s. One of the key structures sustaining growth in the global economy in that period was the so-called chimerica relationship. There we go. This unfortunate term was, I don't know if it was coined by Neil Ferguson, but at least he ran with it. And the idea here is that there was a complementarity between the U.S. and the Chinese economies that meant that growth in one supported growth in the other. So even though there were persistent tensions and resentments that come out of this structure of alienation hierarchy that is intrinsic to the growth process, nonetheless, the growth in one sustained growth in the other, and that really allowed the relationship to continue on a strong footing. And what's interesting here is that even though the structure of the economy in the two is very different, the organization of the sort of forms of integration of the working class in the two countries was very strongly similar. So following the crisis of the 1970s, the power of labor in both countries was broken. There was a large reserve of migrant labor that was drawn upon to supply low-wage work. And the possibilities for individual opportunities, such as entrepreneurialism, upward mobility, and also that negative side, the sense that you are responsible for your own success, but also responsible for your own failure. These became very strong in both the United States and China. So there's a very tight parallel in the form of integration that took place after the crisis of the 70s. Here's a quick sort of overview of the distinction with the earlier period of Fordist mass society. There's very strong parallels between the US and China in that period as well. Just to add here that the threat that in the period of neoliberal globalization, as inequality increased and as much of the social safety net was dismantled in both countries, the threat of privation was increasingly important, as also inequalities and differentiations within the labor market and within society increased. The possibilities for divide and rule practices likewise increased in both countries. And I think we're probably familiar with the individualism and consumerism of the last few decades. Now what's going on? The claim I want to make here is that system has broken down. Since 2008, the growth process in the global economy is no longer functioning in a dynamic way. Even though the crisis was resolved in the short term, the sort of deeper structural problems in the global economy did not go away. And those have increasingly pushed the United States and China into a competition over who will seize the benefits of growth in the global economy. But how is this working out at the level of the working class? What is sort of the alternative form of integration of the working class into capitalist growth that we have before us? So perhaps the most well-formed, and this is true again both in the United States and in China, is a nationalist restructuring of the way that the working class is to be integrated into the economy. Again, the threat of privation is still there, but now it's rather different. Now it's increasingly embodied by the foreigner. So before, there was a sense that privation came from just the playing out of the market economy and a general sense of scarcity. Now there's this increasingly there's a sense that the foreigner is stealing our possibilities for growth. And so if we are threatened by privation, that is due to the existence of the foreigner. And again, in the Chinese side, it's the US and vice versa. Divide and rule is very strongly present here, but it's been restructured somewhat, less about internal divisions within the national working class and increasingly formed up as the national working class against I should add here though that the working class is thought to be is asked to act in alliance with the elites of the country so that they can compete with the people of other countries in this sort of zero-sum struggle for global growth. And that also provides a sense of collective purpose, that this is not just about surviving, but is also about creating a thriving country for all of your countrymen. And so the collective purpose is a positive inducement where the sense of divide and rule and the internationalist sense of scarcity is the negative. And one thing to add here is that as Americans of all classes and Chinese of all classes are asked to work together against the threatening foreigner, and I'll wrap up here in just a minute. There's increasing pressure on against divisions within each country to suppress themselves. So, for example, the most prominent and most horrifying of these is the demand that Uyghurs and other Muslims in China be sort of assimilated into a homogeneous Zhonghua Minzu, like the Chinese nation that doesn't have any particular ethnic characteristics. And finally, there's this sense that if you take the deal, then material security will go with that. I want to give a couple of quick examples of this on the US side. This is something that's happening across the political spectrum. Commentators, left, right, and center, are saying we need to form ranks against China so that we can unify internally in our own country. This is David Brooks saying that China is going to bring us together. Here is David Ignatius, sort of a centrist commentator, saying we need better schools. Here's the gesture towards material security. We need better schools, a fair economy, an inclusive, diverse, welcoming society, not just because these values are morally right, but also because they help rebuild our democratic political system so it works again, and yes, can compete with an autocratic and intolerant China. And finally, this figure, Rokana, on the left, says that we should talk more about America winning in the 21st century, about America outdoing China. That China is this authoritarian government and system of values that we don't want the world to share. So this is an inclusive patriotism. So this is sort of the nationalist alternative to the neoliberal form of integration that is broken down. I want to suggest quickly that there's another alternative, an internationalist working class alternative. This is what it looks like. Just kidding, that's sort of unrealistic. This is what it looks like. These are a list of policies that would reshape the way the global economy works by empowering labor, raising wages and working conditions around the world, reviving growth in a way that would reduce the tensions between the US and China that are currently being intensified because of problems of growth in the global economy, and that would reintegrate, would sort of put aside these pressures that are pushing everyone into nationalist conflict, and instead draw everyone together in a new form of globalization, a kind of globalization fundamentally different than the kind we've experienced for the last several decades, that would be much more equitable and would also incidentally make possible investment in the green transformation of production. So happy to talk more about that in the question and answer section. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Jake. It's a wonderful point for you to end, because that already starts to bring exactly the themes that many people were asking us about. So I'd like to invite all the panelists now to open your cameras so that we can go into a whole whole group mode for the discussion. And I'll begin exactly where Jake ended. You know, this, what you call this progressive alternative. A lot of questions are asking, you know, what might that look like? But not only, you know, what it would look like in terms of those points that you listed there, but taking it further to examine how could that come about? And this is not only to Jake, but to Isabella and to Yige as well. Do you see any elements of public discourse or any elements of transnational labor organizing or transnational social movements of other sorts that are trying to reframe the terms of US-China relations, that are trying to reassert a kind of class solidarity lens for how we might want to pressure both governments to take a different approach towards resolving this this trade war that is being inherited by this new administration, and that, you know, is still very much shaped by these structural long-term factors that have been there before this previous administration and will continue for a long time. So do you see any elements that could be hopeful for where that progressive alternative might emerge? How is it that working class solidarity could be cultivated across the US and China? Any of the three of you who would like to jump in first, please go ahead.
Yes, this is an essential question. Obviously, we can sort of design the policy framework that could create a different kind of global economy. But if we can't put together the politics, then it doesn't really matter. It's just a blueprint in our heads. So I think we can see a few places for hope. Unfortunately, the power of the working class is not really one of them. The differentiation and fragmentation within the working class has just been extraordinarily intense globally, right? It's not just in the US, it's not just in China. This was again, the form of neoliberal globalization involved dismantling the power of workers around the world. And it's very hard to see it coming back together just now. I think the set of policies that I outlined, which could be enacted at the global level, would create some of the conditions required for workers to start organizing on their own and actually demanding that those principles be enforced. So that's one important direction, is that we have, over the last 30 years, the world has put together a framework for governing the global economy, but it has written the rules to benefit investors and not really anyone else. So one point to push, and you can see possibilities here, for example, in the Biden administration talking about a trade policy built around labor standards. Now, a lot of that, I think the problem there is that a lot of the impetus is a fundamentally nationalist one, to provide protection for American workers rather than to improve working conditions globally. And so the other side of labor standards has to be development investment. The poor countries would just be cut out of the global economy if labor standards were raised, but the productivity of those economies remained very low. So there's two sides here. It has to be both increased labor standards and environmental standards and similar improvements, but accompanying that has to be a massive increase of investment. And I think that actually is a place that I feel like the pieces are coming together a little bit more strongly, because it would be relatively straightforward for the US and China and the other major powers to work together to dramatically increase investment around global public health and around global environmental priorities to confront the climate crisis. There's a lot of the sort of preconditions are in place. It really is a question of political will and devoting the resources to those things. And I think that those are places in which the US and China could work together in a way that would reduce tensions and build trust, so that we can move off of the course that we're currently on, which is towards a disastrous conflict between the two countries.
Thanks, Jake. Isabella or Yige, would you like to add?
Can I just quickly maybe go back to my case of the 996 campaign? I thought most of you are already familiar with that, so I really went too quickly there. So I think this is a very interesting case. So my point is, I think when maybe I'm being too optimistic or I'm trying to romanticize this case, but I think if the Biden administration will more or less go back to the global, even the globalist, elitist approach, the rhetoric would matter. The human rights rhetoric, even though we all know it's very hypocritical, like it's kind of just a rhetoric, a discourse. But in the case of the feminist movement and also the labor movement, those rhetoric can provide some international leverage for labor and other civic group advocacy in China. And in this 996 case, it's actually a cross-border international solidarity built by the Chinese developers and the US developers in Silicon Valley. And so I think labor should be creative and also to face the reality that we're living in a more and more a virtual world, and where I think the IT industry does have a chance to have some bargaining power. But my point is here, without any international leverage, any standard to hold to, I think it's getting darker and darker on the future, as you can see in the case of the crackdown on labor last year in China. That's what I want to add on to Jake's.
Before turning to Isabella, may I do a follow-up for you, Yige? Because you mentioned a lot about the Chinese students in the US. I wonder whether you might see that group possibly playing a role in building this kind of solidarity. Now, of course, that group is not homogeneous, but it is certainly not say the most poor and marginalized people in China who are able to study abroad. So, many of, a lot of the conversations that might happen on our campuses actually remark on the kind of capitalist class solidarity that might be being built by some of these, intellectual exchanges and so forth and so on. So, would that actually be a force working to limit some of these progressive potentials for solidarity to transform capitalism rather than just establish their own ways of profiting from the ongoing crisis, to continue to profit from the ups and downs of the type of tensions that are taking place?
Very good question, and I don't want to take too much time from Isabella. So just very shortly, I don't want to fully agree with this point, because first, I did a paper on this. My argument is that Chinese international students are really diverse, and to what extent they're gonna represent the bourgeois class consciousness, I think is a question. Not to mention, I think the class structure within China and in the US are very different. So for instance, some students in the US who might be just a very average regular students here taking a gender class, a labor class. But in China, that can be turned into a liberating power, because I think the issue back again, I cannot emphasize this more, that in China is there's no space to maneuver at all in any of the groups, including labor. And that's why you see after the crackdown in recent years, labor and other civil groups are actually joining together to try to carve out a very small niche over there. So I think that the point is, I think the class analysis that to be applied in China and in the US in terms of the composition of different classes might be a little bit different. Final words, like maybe our conventional conceptualization of what counts as a typical worker, right, might be different. In China, there are more atypical type of candidate who might not be industrial, white, there's no white man in China, that kind of worker, but untraditional, unconventional type of people who are on the way towards proletarianization can be future candidates for struggles to come. Yeah, sorry for my long answer.
It's okay. Isabella, would you like to speak to that? There's also questions specifically addressed to you too that I'll pose after.
Yeah, I think Jake and Igor have already made most of the important points. Let me just emphasize that I think to some degree, I mean, not to be naively hopeful, but to some degree, the urgency of rebalancing on China's part in the context of the current crisis might open some space for improved labor standards or increased wages and these kind of things, just because you need to basically increase consumption demand if you want to rebalance in that fashion, right? So in that sense, there might be a very strange kind of niche where the US and China actually, in their hostility, have a common interest in increasing Chinese labor standards, because it's important for China to rebalance, and it's important for the US if they want to deal with the certain kinds of competitive pressures. But it's not straightforward. This is just a preliminary thought. Another point I think is that, to emphasize more what Jake already said, I think that in terms of the whole question of public finance for recovery in the US, so far, most of the discussion has been around Made in America. But I think there's also scope to say, okay, if under a Biden administration, there is another major fiscal stimulus push, and let's say there might even be something around the lines that has been discussed more in the spring and summer than now, but so there has been this idea around of creating a national public finance agency that would basically finance the reconstruction of the American economy, right? We could conceive of this including certain labor standards and environmental standards in the procurement policies that such a finance corporation would use, which again could be something that could go beyond simply saying, okay, this has to be made in America, right? So in other words, I think that the pandemic and the big structural questions that it raises do create a certain opening, but the question is there enough political organization to utilize these openings? And I'm not so sure about that part.
Yeah, thank you. There was one question which was exactly about, what might we expect in the United States in terms of, is this going to be just another type of Obama-Biden type neoliberal administration, or even the 90s Democratic type of neoliberalism, or would this be a turn towards a new Keynesianism, which you seem to have been describing? But the question that a participant posed to you, Isabella, actually pertained the alternative possibility, the kind of nationalist possibility that Jake also mentioned, of, if this is elements of fascism, how do you see these taking place in the US and in China? Because in your presentation, it was not clear, at least to some of the attendees, whether you were referring specifically to only one or the other or both, and if so, how are these elements different or similar in both of those places, if we are going to make these analogies to fascism?
Okay, so let me clarify the status of my argument. My argument was basically using the analysis of Morris Dobb of the metropolis, so the core countries of the capitalist system, and looking at how at some stage of capitalist development, there can be a situation where basically all niches of investment are filled, if you want so to put it in very simple terms, which drives down the profit rate, which then creates an outward drive on the part of capital, which then, as a result of this outward drive, puts pressure on the domestic labor market, which can result in a situation where the so-called reserve army of labor would be increasing, while at the same time, thanks to these outward investments, consumption goods are getting cheaper, and the working class in the core economy to some extent is actually benefiting from this outward drive, which creates a certain scope to integrate the working class, or even more so the middle class in the core economy, into a state protected capitalist project that can transition into certain fascist elements. I'm not saying we are living in fascism. I'm not saying this is a fascist state. I'm just saying this can give rise to tendencies in that direction. Now, the analysis that I've laid out here is really from the perspective of the core country, less than from the perspective of the periphery country. I don't have a strong view on the periphery country, to be brutally honest. And I think that actually in many ways, Igor and Jake are much more careful in their analysis of nationalism in China. It's just something that I haven't done a lot of research on. I think that given the nature of the constellation that Dobb was analyzing, this was what he foregrounded, but I'm not taking, I mean, I didn't comment on it, but I'm not taking an implicit stance by this omission, but I would rather have Jake or Igor to fill in. I think they are more qualified to answer that question as regards China.
Would either of you like to jump in on this? Or if not, there's other questions that are being posed that we could engage as well. Okay, I'll bring in another one, but you can also integrate to your answer if you'd like. There's a very interesting question directed primarily to Igor, but feel free to jump in as well, Jake and Isabella, about what we might expect from the continued rapid technological development that we see in China. Of course, 5G, but even more broadly, this huge boom of service economy, of delivery apps, and economic transformations around the use of WeChat for currency payments and so forth and so on. That coexisting with that 996 labor regime that Igor pointed out, how might we expect that this type of technological development might play a role in terms of building a working class consciousness in China? And I'll add to the attendees' question that what I think is really relevant about this question is that from my experience in China, I see the technological development in China articulated in hyper-nationalistic terms of building a kind of nationalistic pride and building that kind of integration that Jake was talking about of the domestic elites with the working classes. At the same time, rapid technological development, say outpacing the development of poverty alleviation programs, of labor regulations, and of other types of structural guarantees of a welfare state that might become necessary now, given the dismantling of the socialist guarantees of previous decades. On the other hand, this rapid technological development might actually be aggravating, might be actually a force, a dysfunctional force, a factor for growth in the way that Jake was talking about, or at least a factor that might actually be exacerbating socioeconomic inequalities that would push against that kind of nationalistic, like cohesion. So, how do you see this technological development playing a role in these competing tendencies of, building kind of a nationalistic solidarity, but on the other hand, also aggravating conditions that could actually lead towards more class struggle?
I thought you just had a brilliant analysis already, because you unpacked it a little bit, showing the contradictions from within already. What I can add on is just maybe restate what you have to say. Like, I think there are several issues, like nowadays, like everybody is claiming they're studying, the platform economy, the digital labor issues, but there are several issues. One is, I think technology is definitely, can help circulation if you think about, the virtual currencies. But it's also, I think, it's nothing new if you think about, advancement in technology in the Marxian sense, right? Every round of this kind of technological revolution, it increased profitability for capital, but that's not necessarily guarantee increase of labor's benefit. The share of the pie might not be increased for labor. it's a political question whether you can get more benefit from this increase of profitability. Then again, right, it goes back to whether you have those structural and associational bargaining power. And also, I think some of in the audience might be also curious about the issue of the surveillance, right? Which is tied to this question of the, the Chinese technology, right? And the privacy code, which I think is a separate issue. So I agree with you. I'm not a technological determinist, right? So I see it's a political issue whether you can there must be struggle to lead to certain outcomes. Technology itself will not determine this. And just to add on that, I think nationalism, I think it's definitely a factor there, but it depends on whether China can successfully get away with the current tension with the US, because Huawei and Honor, Huawei just sold off Honor, the smartphone business entirely, I think, because otherwise that line of Huawei's product cannot even survive. And Huawei is trying to use all those ways to get away with the besiege. I think it's a big question right there, being put on the entity list. So it's we don't know. We don't know yet. And finally, I think everything in terms of the how successful the internal circulation would be, right? Basically, it's a question about how much China can be successful as a rising global geopolitical power, because in order to increase consumption, you have to increase private debt. China's debt level is now at 30% of the GDP, but US is way higher than that, which is backed up by the dollar hegemony. So everything will be reduced to the question whether China can achieve this hegemonic status to back up its consumption. That's what I can see through this.
Yeah, I just want to add 2 quick points. One is, I think that the discourse about technology is really sort of fixated on new products, and there's this idea that wealth in society is driven by increasing technology, which is conflated with new products. I think that's quite wrong. The application of technology right now is primarily about moving value from particular companies to a different set of companies, and it's not really creating very much new wealth in society at all. And the corollary to that point is that to create greater wealth in society, which would significantly reduce all the tensions that we're facing right now globally, the key to that is it involves technology, but it's the application of existing technologies in countries that are currently excluded from them by a lack of capital, and excluded from them by the intellectual property monopolies of the rich countries, and by a lack of education and all these things that a global development agenda would be able to address.
All right, well, we are out of time, but I wanted to thank our 3 panelists for their really wonderful and thought-provoking presentations, and also for Gustavo, Oliveira for handling the moderation and Q&A so expertly. If you get the chance, I wanted to just remind everyone to just take a minute and sign up for the Long Institute's mailing list. This will be our last webinar of the year, and so I wish everyone good luck finishing up the fall semester or fall quarter. I hope everyone has a safe, healthy, and happy holiday season, and I will see hopefully all of you back in 2021. So take care.